The day my own son stood in front of me and stretched both arms across the doorway. I realized a house could stop feeling like home long before anyone changed the locks. "You're not coming in, Dad," he said quietly. "Not while Claire's family is here." I stared at him for several seconds, searching his face for some sign that this was a joke. There wasn't one. Without another word, I turned around, walked back to my pickup truck, and drove away. Before I even backed out of the driveway, I called my attorney. "My name is Martin Caldwell. I'm 63 years old, retired, and until 2 years ago I spent more than 3 decades overseeing maintenance inspections for our city's public utilities department. My career revolved around catching small problems before they became disasters. Every valve, every inspection report, every signature mattered. Ironically, the biggest fraud I would ever uncover wasn't at work. It was inside my own family. My wife Linda and I have been married for 38 years. We met in our 20s, married in a modest backyard ceremony, and slowly built a life that never looked extraordinary from the outside. We paid our bills, raised our son, and eventually finished paying off our home. That house wasn't just another property. It represented decades of overtime shifts, postponed vacations, and sacrifices we never complained about. Our son, Dylan, is 34 now. 6 years ago, he married Claire, an organized, intelligent woman who worked as a legal assistant at a respected estate planning firm downtown. She was friendly, remembered birthdays, never arrived empty-handed, and always seemed eager to help. At least, that's what we believed. After retirement, my routine became wonderfully predictable. Linda tended her flower garden. I repaired anything around the house that made even the smallest strange noise. Every Sunday evening, our longtime friend Frank Mercer would stop by carrying a 6-pack and enough opinions to fill the entire backyard. Life was peaceful. Dylan visited regularly during the first year of his marriage, but those visits slowly became less frequent. Linda worried about it far more than I did. "Young couples get busy," I'd tell her. "They're building their own lives." She wanted to believe that. So did I. Looking back now, the warning signs were everywhere. We simply didn't recognize them. One evening, Dylan casually asked whether Linda and I had ever established a living trust. The question seemed harmless. "We've got wills," I answered. "They've worked just fine for years." He nodded thoughtfully. "You should probably update everything," I laughed. "I'll get around to it eventually." That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. At the time, it meant nothing. A month later, someone from a title company called asking to confirm an appointment I had never scheduled. I assumed they dialed the wrong number. Soon after that, several pieces of mail disappeared. Not everything, only certain envelopes, bank statements, property notices, financial documents. I blamed the postal service. Frank joked that someone was stealing my bills to save me money. We laughed and moved on. One Saturday afternoon, I stopped by Dylan and Claire's apartment to return a ladder he'd loaned me. As I walked toward the porch, I heard Claire speaking on her phone through the slightly open screen door. "I just need 6 more months," she whispered. "No one is losing the restaurant. I have a plan." I immediately stepped back so she wouldn't realize I'd overheard. The restaurant? I hadn't even known they owned one. Later, I learned they had invested nearly every dollar they possessed into a neighborhood restaurant that was drowning in debt. Every month it lost thousands. Loans piled up, bills went unpaid, investors demanded answers. Pressure has a way of changing people, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. The discovery that changed everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I visited our local bank to add Linda's name to a certificate of deposit I'd opened years earlier. The branch manager, Susan Harper, greeted me with her usual smile before suddenly becoming very quiet as she reviewed my account. "Mr. Caldwell," she said carefully, "when did you grant power of attorney?" I frowned. I never did. She turned her computer monitor toward me. There appears to be one on file. My stomach tightened. The document listed Claire Caldwell as my attorney-in-fact with authority over my banking, financial accounts, and real estate. According to the paperwork, I had signed everything months earlier, except I hadn't. I looked at the signature. At first glance, it resembled mine, but only barely. The curve of the M was wrong. The final stroke never dipped the way I always wrote it. Someone had copied my handwriting, someone who hadn't copied it well enough. I left the bank without saying much. Instead of driving home, I headed directly to the county records office. Less than an hour later, I sat alone reading documents that made my blood run cold. Attached behind the fraudulent power of attorney was paperwork preparing the transfer of ownership for my fully paid home. Everything was ready. Only one final approval remained before someone else could legally claim the house Linda and I had spent nearly 4 decades building together. I sat silently inside my truck, gripping the steering wheel. For the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering who had done it. I was wondering how many people I loved already knew. That evening, I didn't tell Linda everything. After nearly 4 decades of marriage, she could usually tell when something was wrong before I said a single word, but this time I simply claimed I had a headache and spent most of the evening pretending to watch television. I barely heard anything on the screen. My mind kept replaying the forged signature. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those papers waiting in the county office, ready to transfer ownership of our home. The following morning, I contacted an attorney recommended by our bank manager. Her name was Rebecca Lawson, a veteran estate litigation lawyer with a reputation for dismantling fraud cases piece by piece. She greeted me with a firm handshake, listened without interrupting, and examined every document through narrow reading glasses. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "this isn't a misunderstanding." I remained silent. "This is intentional." She pointed at the notary seal. "Have you ever met this notary?" "No." "Have you ever signed a power of attorney?" "Never." Rebecca nodded. "I thought so." Within minutes, she searched the state's notary registry. The name printed beneath the seal wasn't listed anywhere. She searched again using different spellings. Nothing. Finally, she closed her laptop. "The notary doesn't exist." For several seconds, the room was completely quiet. Someone hadn't simply copied my signature. They had created an entirely fake legal document. Rebecca explained our options carefully. First, she would immediately file paperwork revoking the fraudulent power of attorney before anyone attempted to complete the property transfer. Next, she would subpoena records connected to Claire's workplace, hoping to identify where the forged documents had been created. Finally, if the evidence supported it, she would prepare both civil and criminal complaints. Before I left, she looked directly at me. "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't confront anyone." I frowned. "Not even my son?" "Especially not your son." She explained that people facing exposure often destroyed evidence or coordinated stories once they realized an investigation had begun. "If they're responsible," she said, "let them believe everything is normal." "How long?" "About 6 weeks." 6 weeks. It sounded impossible. Yet I agreed. Keeping that promise turned out to be one of the hardest things I'd ever done. A few nights later, I finally told Linda everything. She didn't interrupt. She read every page Rebecca had copied for us twice. When she reached the forged signature, she placed the papers neatly on the kitchen table and folded her hands. "I invited that woman into this house," she said softly. Neither of us spoke. I trusted her. I had never seen Linda angry without raising her voice. This was different. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't crying. She simply looked disappointed in a way that somehow felt far worse. "Do you think Dylan knows?" she finally asked. I honestly don't know. She closed her eyes. I hope he doesn't. So do I. The following weeks crawled by. We continued accepting Dylan's phone calls. We attended birthday dinners. Claire smiled exactly as she always had. She hugged Linda goodbye after family meals. She asked about the garden. She complimented my latest woodworking project. If she felt guilty, she never showed it. Rebecca, however, stayed busy. Every few days she called with another update. The fake notary stamp had been traced to an online order. The purchase information pointed toward Claire. Digital records connected drafts of the forged paperwork to a computer accessed using credentials assigned to her office account. Piece by piece, the evidence grew stronger. Then Rebecca called with the news we'd been waiting for. The power of attorney has officially been revoked. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Our house? Completely protected. She paused. We're ready. Ready. Such a small word. Yet it meant our family was about to change forever. 3 days later, Dylan invited everyone to dinner. Claire's parents had driven into town for the weekend, and the family planned to celebrate together. Rebecca advised me to speak with Dylan before the meal began. Give him the opportunity to hear the truth directly from you. That Saturday evening, I drove across town alone. Linda remained home. She couldn't bear the thought of walking into that house. As I approached the front porch, I rehearsed what I intended to say. I wasn't interested in shouting. I simply wanted my son to understand what had happened before lawyers and police became involved. The front door opened. Dylan stepped outside. The moment he saw me, his expression tightened. Without saying hello, he moved into the doorway and stretched both arms across the entrance. You can't come in, Dad. I looked at him, confused. What are you talking about? Claire's parents are inside. I know. This isn't the time. It actually is. He shook his head. No. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. Then Claire appeared behind him carrying a kitchen towel. She stopped immediately after seeing my face. Something told me she already knew exactly why I was there. Claire stood frozen in the hallway, her smile disappearing the instant our eyes met. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The sounds of laughter drifted from the dining room behind her. Plates clinked together, someone poured drinks, and her father was in the middle of telling a story that drew another round of laughter from the table. None of them knew the evening had just changed forever. Claire forced a weak smile. Martin, she said carefully, can we talk after dinner? I shook my head. No. She glanced nervously toward the dining room. My parents are here. I know. This isn't the right time. I looked directly at her. I've spent 6 weeks waiting for the right time. Dylan stepped between us. Dad, please. His voice wasn't angry, it sounded desperate. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed a folded envelope Rebecca had prepared. Inside were copies of the forged power of attorney and the county documents connected to our house. I held them out. Either one of you want to explain these? Neither of them reached for the papers. Claire's eyes immediately fell to the envelope. She recognized it. I could tell. Her shoulders stiffened, and the color slowly drained from her face. Dylan looked from me to his wife. What is he talking about? Claire remained silent. I unfolded the first page. This document says I appointed Claire to control my finances. Dylan frowned. What? I never signed it. He looked at Claire. She finally spoke. It isn't what it looks like. I couldn't help letting out a bitter laugh. I've heard that sentence before. She took a slow breath. I was trying to protect everyone. By forging my signature? You don't understand. Then explain it. She hesitated. Our financial situation got out of control. I know about the restaurant. Her eyes widened. You know, I know far more than you think. She lowered her head. It was supposed to be temporary. Temporary. We only needed time. Dylan turned toward her. What is he talking about, Claire? She refused to meet his eyes. The bank wouldn't extend another loan. You told me everything was improving. I thought it would. He stared at her. You said investors were interested. They backed out. The silence between them became almost unbearable. Finally, Claire looked at me again. I wasn't trying to steal your house. I raised an eyebrow. No. I was trying to refinance it. My house? It would have saved the restaurant. I felt my jaw tighten. You planned to use our home as collateral without asking us. It wasn't supposed to stay that way. How long? Just until business recovered. I shook my head slowly. So your solution was identity theft. Tears gathered in her eyes. You and Linda would have been paid back. You forged legal documents. I panicked. You ordered a fake notary stamp. She froze. You know about that? Everything. The word landed like a hammer. Dylan stared at his wife. You forged a notary? Claire began crying. I didn't know what else to do. He stepped backward as though she'd become a stranger. You told me you were meeting investors. I was trying. You said paperwork was routine. It started that way. His voice cracked. Did you forge my father's signature? Claire covered her face. I never wanted it to go this far. Dylan looked completely lost. Answer me. She whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear it. Yes. The hallway became painfully still. At that exact moment, Claire's mother entered from the dining room carrying a serving bowl. She smiled at first, then she noticed everyone's expressions. Is everything all right? Nobody answered. Her smile faded. What's going on? I handed her the copied documents. You should probably read those. She looked confused but accepted them. Within seconds, her expression changed from curiosity to disbelief. She looked at her daughter. Claire. Claire simply cried harder. Her father soon joined us after hearing the silence. He read the papers without saying a word. When he finished, he removed his glasses and looked at Claire with visible disappointment. You did this? She nodded. Her father closed his eyes. You forged someone's name. I thought I could fix everything. He spoke more softly than I expected. No. You made everything worse. Dylan slowly sank into a nearby chair. He wasn't looking at anyone anymore. He stared at the floor as if trying to understand how his life had unraveled in only a few minutes. I placed the envelope back into my pocket. I didn't come here to argue. I looked directly at Dylan. I came because you're my son, and I wanted you to hear the truth from me before lawyers and detectives contacted you. He looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. Are you pressing charges? I answered honestly. That decision isn't mine anymore. Rebecca had already submitted the evidence. By now, the legal process had begun. Whether any of us wanted it or not, there was no turning back. I quietly walked toward the front door. This time, Dylan didn't try to stop me. He simply stood there watching as I walked away, carrying the weight of a family that would never be the same again. The investigation moved far more quickly than I expected. 3 days after I left Dylan's house, Rebecca called and asked me to meet her at the courthouse. When I arrived, she already had several folders spread across the conference table. They found more than we expected, she said. Every document investigators recovered pointed in the same direction. Claire hadn't acted on impulse. She had planned everything. Emails recovered from her office computer showed months of research into property transfers, powers of attorney, and refinancing procedures. Browser histories revealed searches about forged signatures, notary requirements, and how quickly deed transfers could be processed after filing. She had even created a checklist. Seeing those records hurt more than the forged paperwork itself. This wasn't one terrible decision made during a moment of panic. It was a carefully organized plan. Rebecca slid another document across the table. The restaurant's financial records. The business had been losing money for nearly 2 years. Loans had piled up, credit cards were maxed out, suppliers had stopped extending credit, payroll checks had started bouncing. The restaurant wasn't weeks away from failing. It had already collapsed. Claire simply refused to accept it. Instead of admitting defeat, she convinced herself she could save everything with one more loan. That loan would have been secured by my home, a home Linda and I had spent nearly 4 decades paying for. A week later, detectives asked me to give a formal statement. The interview lasted almost 3 hours. They wanted every detail, every conversation, every suspicious phone call, every missing bank statement. When the questioning finally ended, one detective closed his notebook. "You noticed the warning signs sooner than most people would have." I shook my head. "No, I noticed them too late." Driving home that afternoon, I realized how easily trust can blind someone. When you believe people love you, you rarely question their motives. Sometimes that's a beautiful thing. Sometimes it's dangerous. A month after the investigation began, formal charges were filed. Forgery, identity theft, attempted property fraud. Claire surrendered voluntarily through her attorney. There were no dramatic television moments, no handcuffs in front of cameras, no shouting outside the courthouse, just paperwork, court appearances, and a growing silence between members of 2 families that had once celebrated every holiday together. Dylan called me 2 days later. His voice sounded exhausted. "Dad?" I waited. "I didn't know." "I believe you." "You do?" "If I'd thought you were part of it, I wouldn't have come to your house that night." He didn't speak for several seconds. "I keep replaying everything." "So do I." "I should have asked more questions. Maybe. I should have noticed something. You trusted your wife. So did you." His words caught me off guard. He was right. We had both trusted the same person. The difference was that he had built a future with her. I had welcomed her into our family. "Dad." "Yes?" "I'm sorry." It wasn't an apology for Claire's actions. It was a son apologizing because he felt responsible for pain he never intended to cause. "I know," I answered quietly. "Come by the house whenever you're ready." Another long silence followed. "I don't think Mom wants to see me." I looked toward Linda, who was trimming roses in the backyard through the kitchen window. "She loves you, even now, especially now." When I told Linda about the conversation, she wiped her gardening gloves against her jeans and looked toward the fence. "I've been angry," she admitted, "but never at Dylan. He blames himself." "He shouldn't." She paused. "He married someone he loved." "So did I." That sentence stayed with me. Life doesn't come with guarantees. Sometimes good people place their trust in the wrong person. That doesn't make them foolish. It makes them human. Several weeks later, the criminal case reached a conclusion. Rather than risk trial, Claire accepted a plea agreement. She admitted to forging legal documents connected to my finances and accepted responsibility for the attempted property transfer. The court sentenced her to probation, ordered her to repay our legal expenses, and barred her from working again in any position requiring legal certification. Her career ended the same day the judge signed the order. The restaurant closed before the end of the month. Its doors never reopened. The building sat empty for months afterward, a quiet reminder that desperate decisions rarely solve desperate problems. Not long after the sentencing, Dylan moved into a small rental across town. The separation became official. Although the divorce would take much longer, everyone knew there was no repairing what had been broken. Some betrayals destroy more than marriages. They erase the future people thought they were building. As winter approached, our house finally began feeling peaceful again. The legal files were stored away. The county records were corrected. Our deed remained exactly where it belonged. For the first time in months, Linda smiled without forcing it. Yet one important conversation still remained. It was the conversation I had waited months to have with my son. Winter settled over the neighborhood, bringing quiet mornings and evenings that arrived earlier than either Linda or I liked. The legal battle was finally over, but the emotional weight lingered in every room of our home. For weeks, Dylan and I only spoke over the phone. The conversations were polite but short. Neither of us knew how to bridge the distance that had grown between us. Then a few days before Thanksgiving, my phone rang. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "could I stop by?" I looked through the kitchen window at Linda. She was rolling pie dough across the counter. Of course. An hour later, Dylan pulled into the driveway. He stepped out carrying nothing except a small paper bag from the bakery Linda loved. It was the kind of thoughtful gesture he used to make before life became complicated. When I opened the front door, he stood there looking older than his 34 years. "I'm sorry," he said before I could speak. I invited him inside. Linda walked into the hallway, drying her hands on a towel. For a moment, mother and son simply looked at each other. Then she wrapped her arms around him. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Sometimes forgiveness begins long before the words are spoken. We sat around the kitchen table drinking coffee just as we had hundreds of times before. Finally, Dylan broke the silence. "I keep asking myself how I missed it." I leaned back in my chair. "Because you trusted someone you loved. I should have questioned things. Maybe. I believed every explanation. So did we." He rubbed his forehead. "I feel like I failed both of you." Linda reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "No. You made a mistake. There's a difference." He looked at her, his eyes red. "I almost lost your home." She gently shook her head. "No. The person who forged those papers almost did. You didn't." Those words seemed to lift something from his shoulders. Not completely, but enough. Thanksgiving arrived 2 days later. For the first time in months, our dining room felt alive again. Frank arrived early, carrying his usual homemade rolls and insisting they were better than anything sold in stores. Linda laughed for what felt like the first genuine time in nearly a year. During dinner, nobody mentioned lawyers. Nobody mentioned courtrooms. Nobody mentioned Claire. Instead, we talked about football, gardening, neighborhood gossip, and Frank's latest attempt to repair a lawnmower that had never actually been broken. It felt normal. Normal had become something worth celebrating. Later that evening, after everyone finished eating, Dylan stayed behind to help me wash dishes. As we stood side by side at the sink, he quietly said, "I don't expect things to be the same." I nodded. "They won't be." He looked disappointed. "But that doesn't mean they can't still be good." He smiled slightly. "I'd like that." "So would I." Over the next several months, he visited more often. Sometimes we worked in the garage. Sometimes we watched old baseball games. Other times we simply sat on the back porch saying very little. Our relationship wasn't repaired overnight. Trust never returns that way. It grows slowly, one honest conversation at a time. Claire eventually moved to another state after the divorce became final. I heard she found work outside the legal field, but beyond that, I never asked questions. Holding on to bitterness would only have given her mistakes more power over my life. Linda agreed. One spring afternoon, she stood beside me in the garden and smiled at the flowers beginning to bloom. "You know," she said, "I used to think the strongest part of this house was its foundation." I looked at her. "What do you think now?" She slipped her hand into mine. "It's the people who refuse to give up on each other." I smiled. After everything we had survived, I knew she was right. The paperwork had been replaced, the fraudulent records had been erased, the locks had been changed. But none of those things truly saved our home. What saved it was honesty. What protected it was family choosing to rebuild instead of walking away. Looking back now, I don't remember the court dates as clearly as I remember that Thanksgiving dinner. I don't remember the legal documents as much as I remember my son standing in my kitchen, asking for another chance. A house can be repaired with money, a title can be corrected with paperwork, but relationships require something far more valuable. They require truth, accountability, forgiveness, and time. Those are things no court can ever order. And after everything that happened, I finally understood that protecting a family isn't about guarding a house. It's about never letting deception become stronger than love.